This passage from Luke's gospel certainly has its fill of moral lessons. As Tom was reading it, it seemed to me like almost every sentence could be taken on its own and become the central lesson in an entire children's series of books or movies. Today, though, I want to focus on how the bulk of this reading is informed by what we find in verse 31. Do to others as you would have them do to you. We find in this passage what we often hear called the golden rule. From a young age, we get taught this fundamental lesson. We hear it in our preschool classrooms, in books, in TV shows, in movies. We hear it from teachers of all kinds in our lives. And this simple sounding lesson is a great starting point for creating a world where people are treated fairly and kindly. And it sounds simple. And in an ideal world, it is an easy practice to follow. We know how we like others to treat us, so we should in turn treat others like that, right? And yet I don't have to look back very far to see where in my own life I forget to follow this golden rule. I just have to look at some of the time I've spent driving through this new, unfamiliar place. I've ended up in the wrong lane a number of times, or found myself driving in a lane and there's a parked car, and now I need to get over. And when I'm in the right lane, the correct lane, and someone else needs to come into my lane, I know that I get annoyed more quickly. And it takes me a minute to remind myself that I don't know their circumstances and that I should be gracious with them, because it's really not going to affect my timeline or my day. Jesus gives us a few examples of the ways that we tend to skirt around the golden rule. Over the next few verses, he very pointedly asks what credit it is to us if we just do the easy thing. He asks, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? And if you do good to those who do good to you, and if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, of course it's easier to love someone who loves you, and to do good to someone who does good to you, and to lend to someone you expect to give it back to you. It's safe, and it's a comfortable place to be able to do all these things. We don't have to push our boundaries or risk anything of ourselves to love those who love us. And with each of these questions, Jesus asks, what credit is that to you? He knows how we like to think highly of ourselves, and he knows about how we prefer to do those things that aren't going to challenge us. But the golden rule is challenging. Treating others as we want to be treated demands us to be more inclusive and intentional in our relationships than usually comes naturally to us. Jesus is challenging the disciples and all who hear this message to reflect on what it truly means to treat others well. He's forcing us to hear that what we like to do is not always what we ought to do. And even though we've been taught this from a young age, even though this golden rule is almost inherently a part of how we see the world, we end up breaking it time and time again. Why? Because we're sinners. Jesus tells the disciples, for even sinners love those who love them, and do good to those who do good to them, and lend to sinners to receive as much again. We strive to be the best that we can be, but we grow tired or lazy. We forget the depth of meaning in this rule of living and build walls around ourselves and our communities. When we get caught in cycles of only helping our own circles out, we close out most of the world. As humans, and especially in our Western culture, we have given certain people groups higher preference in our loving, our lending, and our doing good. We live in a system centuries in the making that tells us to love certain categories more than others. Straight, white, able-bodied, affluent, men. We live in a system that encourages us to do the most good and to lend the most money to people who fall in those same categories. It doesn't take much effort to see the injustice in that. We know in our heads that God doesn't choose preference among those categories. We know that our God is one of mercy, joy, peace, and love. So how do we embody God's approach to loving others? How do we love someone while hating this injustice? I think that can be a really tricky line to walk. I think that our current culture likes to reject mercy in favor of vengeance. Something that is really important for us to remember is that showing mercy, being merciful as our God is merciful, does not mean that anything goes. Just because we believe in mercy for ourselves and for others does not mean that we stand by and allow injustices to take place. Mercy means that we see the humanity of every person, and we love them, and we work with them to make this world a place where peace and justice are made known to all. For a lot of us, that is going to take a lot of sacrifice of things we have come to love. Our status, our power, our influence. And I believe that working for God's peace and justice is going to require significant change in the systems we're a part of. And as someone who has historically benefited from most of these systems, I'm going to have to reframe how I see my place in this world. This life that follows the golden rule truly, do to others as you would have them do to you, is not an easy one. Robert Darden writes of this passage, it calls us to expand the circle of our concern beyond the narrow boundaries of group or tribe. It asks us to sacrifice our long-cherished sense of aggrievement toward our enemies, rendering them in the process not enemies at all, but fellow sinners forgiven by God. The life we are called to sets us as equals with every other person. The life we are called to shifts the center of our life from ourselves to God. As we reflect on the difficulties that exist in this way of living, it's important that we understand that if we want to follow this teaching from Christ, we need to begin with being merciful with ourselves. We can recognize the ways that we participate in and support oppressive systems while maintaining an image of ourselves that does not impede our self-love. We can see the ways that we need to change and grow while loving who we are and embracing the hope of who we can still become. Each of us is on our own journey. Whether we're learning more about inclusion and racial justice, the impact of the church on the LGBTQ+ community, discriminatory housing laws, or the effects of consumerism, on environmental destruction, we can love ourselves. We have to love ourselves. As Jesus tells us, do not judge and you will not be judged. Do not condemn and you will not be condemned. Forgive and you will be forgiven. We can start all of these practices with ourselves. Change does not come easily, especially to those who have lived with little resistance from the outside world. But we are a community of faith. This group of people, in this space, at home, we can support one another as we embark on this journey together. We can love one another while holding each other accountable. One of my favorite shows over the last several years, especially when I feel like I need to watch something that's going to make me feel good, is the Netflix show Queer Eye. And I'm sure that many of you have already seen it or are familiar with the formula that they follow. The hosts are the Fab Five. These are 5 queer people who help make over a hero's life in 5 days. They cover everything from food and diet to clothing and grooming, as well as interior design and culture. And it's amazing to see the transformation that these hosts can make on a person. A new wardrobe, haircut, and home remodel can really change how we see someone. But what makes the show so special and so great to watch are the internal transformations that take place. The heroes go into the week expecting to look different at the end. And what happens is that each of these Fab Five help teach them and us how to love ourselves better. They show us what honesty, forgiveness, and self-confidence can do. They teach us that with a little more self-love, we will have so much more love to share with the world. In their own way, they're reinforcing the last verse in this passage from Luke. A good measure pressed down, shaken together, running over will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back. In other words, if we can give love to ourselves, we will have love running over and out to others. Thanks be to God.